The Law of Wanting, Introduction. This law was clearly understood by Neville Goddard. The moment you want, you declare separation. And separation is what manifests. That single sentence contains a truth most people never confront. Not because it is complex, but because it is uncomfortable. It overturns the very posture from which nearly everyone approaches manifestation. It exposes a silent error that has nothing to do with technique, effort, or worthiness, and everything to do with identity. Neville Goddard understood this law with unsettling clarity. Neville was not a motivational speaker, nor a self-help optimist. Born in Barbados in 1905 and later living and teaching in New York, he was a disciplined metaphysical thinker who devoted his life to one radical premise: consciousness is the only reality. Long before manifestation became fashionable, Neville taught that scripture, psychology, and life itself point to the same conclusion. Man does not attract what he wants. He expresses what he is conscious of being. He lectured quietly, often to small audiences, and yet his ideas endured because they were not comforting fantasies. They were laws, impersonal, exact, unforgiving in their precision. Neville did not promise that desire would be rewarded. He warned that desire, when misunderstood, becomes the very thing that delays fulfillment. This is where most people go wrong. They believe that wanting is the beginning of creation. Neville taught the opposite. Wanting is evidence that creation has not been assumed. Wanting is not neutral. It is not hopeful. It is a declaration, a psychological confession that the thing desired is absent, distant, future, or withheld. And consciousness, which Neville called the only creative power, does not negotiate with intention. It responds faithfully to the assumption. The law does not ask what you hope for. It does not respond to effort. It does not reward sincerity. It reflects the state. When you say, "I want," you are not asking reality to give you something. You are informing consciousness of who you are in relation to that thing. You are occupying the state of not having, and that state, once occupied, must externalize itself because the law is exact. This is why so many people feel trapped in cycles of visualization, affirmation, and striving that never seem to resolve. They are loyal to desire, but disloyal to the state that fulfills it. They repeat words of possession while secretly living in the inner posture of waiting. And waiting, in Neville's system, is not patience, it is postponement. Neville was precise about this. He taught that creation is finished. Everything that can be experienced already exists as a state of consciousness. You do not create outcomes, you move into states. And the moment you move into a state, the world rearranges itself to reflect it. Not because it chooses to, but because it must. Here is the uncomfortable implication. If wanting persists, it is because the state has not been entered. If desire feels urgent, it is because the assumption is absent. If manifestation feels like work, it is because the old identity is still negotiating for permission. Neville never asked people to suppress desire. He asked them to understand it. Desire, rightly understood, is not something to chase. It is something to resolve. The resolution of desire occurs the moment you assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, not as emotion, not as excitement, but as acceptance. Acceptance is the end of wanting, and the end of wanting is the beginning of inevitability. This is why Neville insisted that faith is not belief in an outcome, but loyalty to a state. You do not wait for the world to change so that you can feel fulfilled. You feel fulfilled first, and the world follows as a shadow. Wanting reverses this order. It demands proof before assumption, and the law never grants proof to those who wait for it. So understand this clearly before we go any further. The law does not fail people because they want too much. It fails them because they want it all. Not because desire is wrong, but because desire misunderstood becomes separation, and separation, faithfully reflected, becomes the lived experience of delay, distance, and effort. Neville's entire body of work points to one quiet verdict: you were never meant to want what is already yours. The moment you stop asking reality to give and begin allowing consciousness to be, the struggle ends. Not because you forced anything to happen, but because you finally occupied the only position from which anything can. From here on, we are not going to talk about how to get what you want. We are going to talk about how wanting itself has been the obstacle. Chapter 1: The Law of Assumption: Why Wanting Cancels Creation. Neville Goddard called it the Law of Assumption, and he was unyielding about its operation, not because he was stubborn, but because the law itself is unyielding. It does not bend to hope. It does not soften for effort. It does not respond to repetition. It reflects, exactly and impersonally, the state you occupy. This is the point most people miss. They believe manifestation is a process of doing, affirming more, visualizing harder, and maintaining a positive attitude long enough to persuade reality. Neville taught that all of this misunderstands the nature of creation. Creation is not persuaded, it is assumed. An assumption, in Neville's language, is not a thought you repeat. It is a psychological position you accept as true. It is where you stand inwardly when no one is watching, when you are not trying to convince yourself, when the mind is quiet enough to reveal what you actually believe about your relationship to the thing desired. And here is the law in its simplest form. Whatever you assume to be true becomes true in your experience. Not tomorrow, not eventually, not as a reward, but as a reflection. Now consider what happens when you want something. Wanting feels active, but it is passive in the worst way. It places the desired state outside of you. It frames fulfillment as something that must arrive, rather than something that must be entered. Wanting keeps you psychologically positioned on the wrong side of the experience. You are facing the door, knocking, hoping it opens, while never realizing that the door opens only from the inside. Neville was precise about this. He taught that states are real. They are not metaphors, they are actual psychological environments that you occupy. Wealth is a state. Health is a state. Love is a state. Confidence is a state. And wanting is also a state, a very specific one. Wanting is the state of not having. So when you say, I want, you are not stating a preference. You are declaring a location. You are telling consciousness, this is where I am. And consciousness, which Neville identified as the only creative power, does not argue with declarations. It accepts them. This is why the law appears to fail people who are most earnest. They are loyal to desire, but they are loyal to it in the wrong way. They return to wanting again and again, thinking it keeps the dream alive, when in reality it keeps the dream outside of them. Neville warned against this subtle trap. He said that the assumption of the wish fulfilled is the only creative act. Not the effort to believe, not the struggle to feel excited, not the attempt to suppress doubt. The assumption is quiet. It is almost unnoticeable. It does not announce itself. When you assume something to be true, you stop checking for it. You stop looking for signs. You stop negotiating. The inner argument ends, not because you forced it to end, but because there is nothing left to argue about. Wanting, on the other hand, keeps the inner conversation alive. It keeps asking, when will it happen? How will it happen? Why hasn't it happened yet? And every one of those questions reinforces the same assumption. It has not happened. This is why Neville emphasized that time delay is psychological, not external. The delay is not in the world, the delay is in the state. As long as you remain in the state of wanting, time must stretch, because wanting requires a future. Fulfillment exists only in the present. This is where the law becomes uncomfortable, because it removes excuses. It means circumstances do not block you. It means effort does not move you closer. It means sincerity does not earn progress. Only the state does. Neville used to say that the world is a mirror, not a judge. It does not decide what you deserve. It reflects what you assume. And mirrors do not argue with the image placed before them. They reproduce it. So when someone says, "I've been wanting this for years," Neville would hear something very different. He would hear, "I have been occupying the state of not having for years. And the law, faithful as gravity, has done nothing but comply." This is not meant to condemn. It is meant to clarify. The law is not cruel. It is exact. And exact laws are merciful once they are understood, because they remove randomness. They remove luck. They remove the need to beg. Neville taught that the moment you assume the end, the means are set in motion automatically, not because you planned them, but because the state contains its own path of expression. This is why he insisted that trying to figure out how something will happen is a form of unbelief. The how belongs to the state, not to the old identity standing outside it. Wanting insists on managing the path. Assumption rests in the destination. And the destination, once occupied inwardly, exerts a quiet authority over the world. Things begin to rearrange without strain. Conversations happen without planning. Opportunities appear without pursuit. Not because you became more worthy, but because you stopped declaring separation. This is the law that fails people the moment they want. Not because desire is wrong, but because desire left unresolved keeps you standing at the threshold, endlessly rehearsing a future that never arrives. In the next section, we will go deeper into Neville's most important distinction, the difference between states of consciousness and circumstances, and why no circumstance has ever prevented fulfillment, but many have distracted people from entering the state that would dissolve them entirely. Chapter 2, States of Consciousness. Why circumstances never matter. Neville Goddard was relentless on this point because without understanding it, everything else collapses back into effort and superstition. Circumstances do not create states. States create circumstances. The world you see is not the cause of your inner life. It is the effect of it. And until this is grasped, not intellectually but experientially, wanting will continue to feel reasonable, even necessary. Neville taught that life is not happening to you, it is happening to you. This is difficult to accept at first, because the evidence of the senses seems overwhelming. Bills arrive, relationships end, bodies ache, time passes, and all of it appears to demand a response. But Neville insisted that reacting to circumstances as if they were causes is the fundamental mistake. Reaction binds you to the very state you are trying to escape. Here is the principle as he taught it. A state of consciousness is a complete world. When you enter a state, you do not simply adopt a mood, you adopt a point of view, a range of perceptions, a set of reactions, and a future that feels inevitable from within that state. Each state comes with its own logic, its own explanations, its own justifications. This is why two people can face the same circumstance and experience entirely different realities. One sees opportunity, the other sees a threat. One feels guided, the other feels blocked. The difference is not intelligence, effort, or luck. It is the state they are occupying. Wanting as a state is particularly deceptive because it feels active, it feels hopeful, it feels like movement. But in truth, it is a holding pattern. It keeps you psychologically positioned outside the experience you desire, observing it as something separate from yourself. Neville was clear. You do not move circumstances to get into a state. You move into a state, and circumstances move accordingly. This is why he discouraged people from analyzing their situations excessively. The moment you give circumstances the power to determine your inner position, you have reversed the creative order. You have allowed the shadow to dictate the substance. Think carefully about this. If circumstances truly mattered, then change would require force. It would require a struggle against the visible facts. But Neville taught that visible facts are always late. They are the echo, not the voice. By the time something appears in your world, the state that produced it has already been occupied, often unconsciously. This is why wanting feels endless. People want the circumstances to change first, so that they can finally relax into fulfillment. Neville taught that this sequence never works. Fulfillment must come first, not as imagination, not as fantasy, but as assumed identity. He called this living in the end. Living in the end does not mean pretending. It does not mean ignoring reality. It means refusing to let present appearances dictate your inner posture. It means you decide inwardly and quietly who you are being in relation to your desire, and you remain loyal to that decision. Wanting cannot coexist with this loyalty because wanting keeps checking the outside for permission, and every time you check, you reinforce the same assumption: it is not done. Neville illustrated this with unsettling simplicity. He said that if you were truly the person you want to be, you would not be thinking about becoming them. You would be thinking from them. Your concerns would change, your reactions would change, even your silences would change. This is how states reveal themselves, not through affirmations, but through naturalness. Naturalness was Neville's litmus test. If an assumption feels strained, you are not in the state. If it feels dramatic, you are not in the state. If it requires constant mental effort, you are not in the state. A state, once entered, feels ordinary. It feels unsurprising. It does not demand your attention because it has already been accepted. Wanting, by contrast, demands attention constantly. It needs reassurance. It needs signs. It needs progress reports. And in needing these things, it confesses that it does not yet believe. This is why Neville insisted that persistence is not repetition. Persistence is remaining faithful to a state even when the world shows you reasons to abandon it, not fighting the world, not denying it, simply refusing to relocate inwardly. When people fail at manifestation, they often say, "But my circumstances are real." Neville would agree and then remind them that states are realer. Circumstances are temporary expressions. States are generative positions. One dissolves when the other changes. So the question is not whether your circumstances will change, they must. The question is whether you will continue to occupy the state that produces them while waiting for proof that you should move. Wanting keeps you waiting. Assumption moves you inwardly first, and the world, faithful and obedient, follows after. In the next section, we will confront one of the most deeply conditioned errors Neville warned against, the belief that effort, discipline, and forcing can compensate for an unassumed state, and why trying harder often guarantees that nothing moves at all. Chapter 3: The Fatal Error: Why Effort, Discipline, and Forcing Delay Results. Neville Goddard had little patience for the idea that effort creates reality. Not because discipline is useless in life, but because effort is always a signal. And the signal it sends is rarely the one people intend. Effort, in the context of manifestation, is the language of unbelief. This is difficult to hear in a world trained to admire struggle. From childhood, we are taught that effort equals virtue, that discipline proves sincerity, that forcing results is a sign of strength. Neville did not deny the usefulness of effort in the physical world, but he drew a sharp line between action that flows from a state and action used to compensate for the absence of one. The latter always fails. Neville taught that the law of assumption does not respond to strain. Strain is evidence that the old identity is still negotiating for control. It is the old man, as Neville called him, attempting to produce a new world without relinquishing his position. And this is the fatal error. When people try to manifest, they often confuse intensity with conviction. They believe that repeating affirmations more forcefully, visualizing more vividly, or disciplining themselves more aggressively will somehow override the underlying state. Neville warned that this only deepens the contradiction. You cannot force yourself into a state you do not yet accept as true. Force implies resistance. Resistance implies separation. Effort does not move consciousness, assumption does. Neville was precise: if something requires willpower to sustain, it is not assumed. If it feels like maintenance, it is not belief. If it feels like work, you are still trying to persuade yourself, and persuasion is unnecessary when something is accepted. This is why Neville said that the naturalness of a state is the surest sign of its occupancy. When a state is truly entered, action becomes effortless. Behavior changes without internal debate. Choices rearrange themselves without self-control. Discipline, when it appears, arises organically, not as punishment, but as alignment. Trying to act as if, without having assumed the state, only produces exhaustion. It is mimicry without identity. The body moves, but the consciousness remains outside the experience, watching and waiting for validation. Neville described this as acting without being. And acting without being always reveals itself. It carries tension, it feels unnatural, it demands monitoring. It requires constant reinforcement because it has not been inwardly accepted. This is why people burn out on manifestation practices. They are trying to sustain a posture that was never entered. Effort also keeps the focus on the means. Neville warned that the moment you concern yourself with how something will happen, you have left the end and returned to the middle. And the middle is always unstable. It is full of variables. It invites doubt. It encourages comparison. It tempts control. The end, by contrast, is stable. The end is final. The end contains no questions, only acceptance. This is why Neville insisted that the end must be assumed without concern for the means. The means are not your responsibility. They unfold naturally from the state. When you attempt to manage them, you reveal that you do not yet trust the state to express itself. Trying harder does not strengthen belief. It exposes its absence. And this is the irony. The more someone forces manifestation, the more they reinforce the identity of the one who does not have. The more disciplined they become in repeating techniques, the more they confirm that nothing has been resolved inwardly. They remain loyal to wanting, even while telling themselves they are practicing faith. Neville never asked people to stop acting. He asked them to stop acting from the wrong place. Action that flows from an assumption feels inevitable. Action that compensates for doubt feels heavy. The difference is unmistakable once experienced. This is why Neville taught that the old self cannot be trained into fulfillment. It must be abandoned. The old self survives by effort. The new state requires surrender, not surrender to circumstance, but surrender of control over the creative process. When you stop forcing, you are not giving up. You are stepping out of the way. And the moment you step out of the way, the law begins to operate without interference. In the next section, we will examine Neville's most confronting idea, the death of the old identity, the old man. and why no amount of discipline can save a self that must be left behind in order for the promise to be fulfilled. Chapter 4. The old man must die. Identity, not desire, is the barrier. Neville Goddard was uncompromising on this point because, without understanding it, everything reverts back to effort, hope, and delay. He taught that no new reality is ever born until the old identity dies, not improves, not heals, not upgrades, dies. He called this identity the old man. The old man is not evil, he is not broken, he is simply conditioned. He is the sum total of your memories, reactions, disappointments, habits of thought, and emotional reflexes. He is the version of you that learned who you were by reacting to life instead of choosing a state. And here is the crucial truth Neville emphasized. The old man cannot inherit the promise. This is not moral language, it is structural language. The old man lives in wanting. He survives on anticipation, comparison, regret, and effort. Wanting keeps him alive because wanting gives him a role. It allows him to remain the one who is almost there, the one who is trying, the one who is working on it. This is why people resist letting go of wanting more than they realize. Wanting to preserve identity, it keeps the familiar self intact. It allows the old man to continue existing while imagining a different future. Neville exposed this illusion mercilessly. He taught that manifestation does not fail because people want the wrong things. It fails because they want to bring the old self into the new state. They want fulfillment without surrender. They want the promise without transformation. They want to remain who they are and add something to it. The law does not work that way. States do not stack, they replace. You cannot carry the consciousness of lack into the consciousness of fulfillment. You cannot bring the self who doubts into the state that knows. You cannot want and have at the same time, because wanting is the language of the old man, and having belongs to a different identity entirely. Neville described this process using biblical symbolism, but he was always clear that it was psychological, not religious. When Scripture speaks of death, resurrection, or rebirth, Neville said it is describing a change of state. The old conception of self must be abandoned for the new one to be occupied. This is why wanting feels so persistent. It is not just a desire for an outcome, it is loyalty to an identity. Letting go of wanting feels like losing something because, in a sense, it is. You are losing the self who needed to want, and that self resists. The old man will suggest that letting go is irresponsible. He will say you need to stay alert, stay focused, stay vigilant, or everything will fall apart. He will convince you that without effort, nothing moves. He will disguise fear as prudence and doubt as realism. Neville warned that this inner dialogue is not wisdom, it is self-preservation. The old man survives by keeping fulfillment just out of reach, because as long as fulfillment is future, the old man has a purpose. He gets to plan, worry, adjust, and try again. Fulfillment, assumed now, would make him irrelevant. This is why Neville said that the hardest thing for people is not imagining the wish fulfilled, but remaining faithful to it. Faithfulness requires abandoning the inner negotiations. It requires refusing to re-enter the old identity even when circumstances invite it. And circumstances will invite it. The world will present evidence that supports the old state, because the old state created the world you are seeing. Neville was clear about this. When you begin to move inwardly into a new state, the outer world does not immediately reflect it. It continues to echo the old assumption for a time. This delay is not punishment, it is inertia. But here is where most people fail. They interpret the persistence of old circumstances as proof that the new state is not working. And in that moment they return to wanting. They step back into the old identity, reanimating it, giving it life again. They resurrect the old man and then wonder why nothing changes. Neville taught that the old man must be allowed to die of neglect. You do not fight him. You do not argue with him. You do not analyze him endlessly. You simply stop feeding him your attention. You stop returning to his questions. You stop checking the world for confirmation that he still exists. This is not repression. It is relocation. You relocate consciousness. You decide quietly and inwardly who you are now in relation to the desire, and you remain there, not tensely, not anxiously, but naturally. You let the old reactions pass without identifying with them. You let the old thoughts arise without following them. This is what Neville meant by dying to the old man. It is not dramatic. It is subtle. It feels almost anticlimactic. There is no explosion of emotion. There is simply a growing disinterest in the old narrative. The urgency fades. The inner argument loses energy. Wanting dissolves, not because you forced it to dissolve, but because there is nothing left for it to do. And when the old man is no longer being fed, the new state stabilizes. This is the moment when manifestation begins to feel effortless, not because you stopped caring, but because identity has shifted. You are no longer the one who wants. You are the one who expects without anticipation, who rests without passivity, who moves without strain. Neville insisted that this is the only doorway. No amount of discipline can save the old man. No amount of desire can redeem him. No amount of technique can transform him. He must be left behind, and when he is, something quiet but absolute takes his place, a sense of inevitability. Not excitement, not urgency, just knowing. In the next section, we will dismantle one of the most misunderstood ideas in Neville's work, the feeling of the wish fulfilled, and why it has nothing to do with emotion, visualization intensity, or positive thinking, and everything to do with acceptance and naturalness. Chapter 5. The feeling of the wish fulfilled. Why fulfillment is quiet. This is where Neville Goddard is most often misunderstood, and where the law is most frequently distorted into technique. The phrase, the feeling of the wish fulfilled, has been repeated so often that it has lost its precision. Many assume Neville was asking people to generate emotion, to feel excitement, joy, gratitude, or enthusiasm as intensely as possible. He was not. Neville was far more exacting than that. He was not speaking about emotion. He was speaking about acceptance. The feeling of the wish fulfilled is not a surge. It is not a rush. It is not the high people chase when they visualize success or imagine future pleasure. Those experiences still contain desire. They still look forward. They still imply not yet. Fulfillment does not feel like anticipation. Fulfillment feels like normalcy. Neville emphasized this repeatedly. He said that the true sign of assumption is naturalness. When something is truly accepted as real, it no longer draws attention to itself. It does not need to be affirmed. It does not need to be checked. It does not need emotional reinforcement. It simply is. Think carefully about this. If you owned a home, you would not spend your days visualizing living in it. If you were secure in a relationship, you would not rehearse feeling loved. If you trusted your identity, you would not keep proving it to yourself. The desire to feel something intensely is often a signal that acceptance has not yet occurred. Neville taught that emotion belongs to transition, not to arrival. When you imagine the wish fulfilled correctly, the emotional wave subsides quickly, and what remains is a subtle shift in orientation. You feel settled, grounded, less concerned. The mind stops circling the desire because the desire has been resolved inwardly. This is why so many people struggle with Neville's teachings. They are chasing the experience of fulfillment instead of the state of it. They mistake emotional stimulation for assumption, and because emotional states rise and fall, they constantly feel the need to repeat the process, reinforcing the belief that nothing has been completed. Neville warned against this cycle. He said that the correct imaginal act does not produce excitement, it produces relief. Relief is the quiet signal that something has been accepted. Relief says it is done. Excitement says it is coming. This distinction matters more than most people realize. Wanting is loud, fulfillment is quiet. Wanting rehearsals, fulfillment rests. Wanting to watch the world for movement, fulfillment assumes movement is inevitable and stops watching. Neville was insistent that imagination must be used once, correctly, and then dropped. Not repeated obsessively, not maintained through force. Once the end is accepted, repetition becomes unnecessary. At that point, repetition is no longer faith, it is doubt in disguise. This is why Neville said, "Do not be concerned with results." Not because results do not matter, but because concern reveals non-acceptance. The one who is concerned is still waiting, and waiting is simply wanting stretched over time. The feeling of the wish fulfilled is the feeling of no longer needing to feel anything about it. This is deeply counterintuitive in modern manifestation culture, which thrives on stimulation, emotion, and constant engagement. Neville's work cuts directly against that grain. He taught restraint, simplicity, finality. He taught that when the wish is truly fulfilled inwardly, you will notice subtle changes. You stop talking about it internally. You stop asking when. You stop adjusting your approach. You stop seeking reassurance. None of this is forced. It happens naturally as a consequence of acceptance. This is why Neville insisted that the imaginal act must be done in the present tense. The present tense removes anticipation. It collapses the future. It places you psychologically inside the experience rather than reaching toward it. And once inside, wanting has no function. People often fear this moment. They worry that if they stop wanting, they will lose motivation or momentum. Neville taught the opposite. Motivation rooted in desire is unstable. Motivation rooted in identity is automatic. When you assume the end, behavior reorganizes itself without pressure. You do not stop acting, you stop trying to act correctly. Your actions become congruent because they no longer need to produce the outcome. They simply express the state. This is the difference between discipline and alignment. Discipline forces consistency. Alignment makes consistency inevitable. Neville's brilliance was in revealing that the law is not emotional, dramatic, or effortful. It is exact. And exact laws require precision, not intensity. So if you find yourself trying to feel more, trying to generate emotion, trying to stay excited, you are still wanting. And wanting, as you now understand, is the signal that the state has not yet been entered. The invitation Neville offered was far simpler and far more demanding. Enter the state. Accept it as real. Let the feelings settle into normalcy and then leave it alone. In the next section, we will explore what Neville meant by living from the end and why the end, once assumed, dissolves desire entirely and sets the entire chain of events into motion without effort, without strain, and without interference. Chapter 6. Living from the End. Why Desire Ends When the State is Entered. Neville Goddard described living from the end as the final correction to the human habit of striving. Not striving for comfort, not striving for safety, but striving for permission. Most people are not trying to create a better life. They are trying to earn the right to believe one is possible. Neville dismantled that posture entirely. To live from the end is not to imagine a future. It is to relocate consciousness. This is where wanting finally collapses, not through suppression, not through discipline, but through irrelevance. Wanting ends the moment you step into the state that would make wanting unnecessary. Neville insisted that the end contains the means. This was not poetic language. It was a literal description of how states operate. A state is not an image, it is a complete psychological environment. When you enter a state, you automatically inherit its perceptions, its expectations, and its behaviors. You do not need to plan them. They come with the territory. This is why Neville warned against trying to get to the end. The moment you are trying to get there, you are not there. Getting implies distance. Distance implies separation. Separation implies wanting. Living from the end removes distance entirely. Here is the simplest way Neville framed it. If your desire were already fulfilled, how would you be relating to life right now? Not what would you do theatrically. Not what would you post. Not how would you announce it. How would you exist? Your pace would change. Your concerns would shift. Your inner conversations would quiet. You would not be rehearsing the desire, you would be living from it. Neville taught that the end is not a destination you reach after effort. It is a position you assume first. Once assumed, everything that appears to lead to it unfolds naturally, often in ways the rational mind could never predict. This is why he cautioned against planning the path. The old identity believes control equals safety. The state of fulfillment requires trust, not emotional trust, but structural trust in the law itself. When you live from the end, you no longer ask, "What should I do to make this happen?" That question belongs to the one who is still outside the state. Instead, action emerges organically, not as a strategy, not as a compulsion, as expression. Neville emphasized that the correct action never feels like a sacrifice. It feels obvious, it feels timely, it feels appropriate. You are not pushing yourself towards something, you are responding to what is already assumed to be true. This is the part that unsettles the mind trained in effort. Because when you live from the end, urgency disappears. And when urgency disappears, the ego panics. It confuses calm with stagnation. It mistakes peace for passivity. But Neville taught that peace is the surest sign of alignment. The state that fulfills desire does not shout. It does not rush. It does not demand reassurance. It carries a quiet authority. This is why Neville said that signs follow. They do not precede. When you live from the end, you stop looking for evidence, and paradoxically, evidence begins to appear, not because you earned it, but because you stopped blocking it. Wanting blocks because it insists on seeing before believing. Living from the end believes first, and therefore sees. Neville often warned his students that this period, after assumption and before visible change, is the most delicate, not because the law is fragile, but because the mind is tempted to return to wanting. The old man, sensing his irrelevance, tries to reassert control by asking familiar questions. Is it working? Should I do more? What if nothing happens? These questions are not harmless. They are invitations back into the old state. Living from the end requires loyalty, not emotional intensity, but positional loyalty. You do not argue with doubt. You do not suppress it. You simply refuse to relocate inwardly. You remain where you decided to be. Neville called this persistence, not persistence in technique, persistence in being. And here is the final truth about living from the end that most people never hear. Once the end is truly lived in, desire dissolves naturally. You do not kill desire, you complete it. The hunger ends when you are fed. The search ends when you arrive. An arrival does not announce itself with fireworks, it announces itself with stillness. This is why Neville's work feels so radical even today. It removes the chase, it removes the struggle, it removes the endless becoming, It reveals that wanting was never a creative act. It was a signpost pointing you toward a state you had not yet occupied. Once you occupy it, the signpost is no longer needed. In the next section, we will confront one of the last illusions Neville dismantled, the belief that time is an obstacle, and why delay is not caused by the world, but by the moment you step back into wanting after having briefly assumed the end. Chapter 7. Time is not the obstacle. Why delay is psychological, not external. Neville Goddard dismantled the idea of time with surgical precision because as long as people believe time is against them, they will continue to want, and wanting will continue to postpone everything. He taught that time is not a cause. Time is an effect. It is the shadow cast by consciousness as it moves through states. This is one of the most liberating and most confronting truths in Neville's work. Most people believe manifestation fails because it takes time. Neville taught the opposite. It appears to take time because consciousness has not remained where it moved. The delay is not imposed by the world. It is introduced by the mind returning to wanting. Here is the law as Neville understood it. Once a state is fully assumed, the interval between assumption and expression is irrelevant. It is not measured by clocks, it is measured by stability. When people complain that nothing is happening, Neville would listen carefully, not to their words, but to their inner posture. Almost always, delay was accompanied by checking, waiting, evaluating, and adjusting. All of these are movements back into the state of not having. Time stretches when wanting resumes. This is why Neville warned against watching the clock, watching circumstances, or watching progress. Observation, when rooted in doubt, reactivates separation. The moment you look outward to confirm whether something is real, you are implying that it is not yet settled inwardly. This does not mean you ignore life. It means you stop using life as a referee. Neville explained that the world must reflect the state you occupy, but it does not always do so instantly. Not because the law is slow, but because the world you are seeing was generated by a previous assumption. Reality, in this sense, has momentum. It continues to echo the past until a new state becomes dominant. The danger is not that the echo continues. The danger is that you mistake the echo for evidence. When you do, you step back into wanting. Neville was very clear. Checking is relocation. Every time you check to see if it is working, you have moved. You have left the end and returned to the middle. And the middle is where time feels long, uncertain, and heavy. This is why Neville said that faith is not belief in a future outcome, but loyalty to an unseen present fact. Faith is remaining inwardly where you decided to be, regardless of appearances. And this is where most people falter, not because they are weak, but because they misunderstand the nature of persistence. They believe persistence means repeating techniques. Neville taught that persistence means remaining. The remaining is quiet, the remaining is subtle. Remaining does not announce itself, it simply refuses to relocate. This refusal is not stubbornness, it is alignment. You are not fighting the world, you're not denying what you see. You are acknowledging that what you see belongs to a state you no longer occupy. Neville often said that what you are seeing now is the residue of where you were. It is not a verdict on where you are now, but the moment you interpret it as such, you re-enter the old position. Time then becomes the visible symptom of inconsistency. When the assumption is unstable, time stretches. When assumption stabilizes, time collapses. This is why some manifestations appear suddenly, almost impossibly fast. It is not because the desire was stronger, it is because the state was entered cleanly and remained unchallenged. No bargaining, no monitoring, no emotional negotiation. Neville taught that impatience is not a flaw, it is a clue. It reveals that wanting has resumed. It reveals that the mind has shifted back into anticipation, which is simply desire projected forward. The moment you notice impatience, you do not correct it by forcing calm. You correct it by returning inwardly to acceptance. You remind yourself, not emotionally but structurally, that the state has already been entered. This is why Neville said, "It is done." Not as a mantra, but as a verdict. Once something is done, you do not wait for it. You do not rush it. You do not supervise it. You live your life from the position of someone for whom it is settled. This does not make you passive. It makes you unburdened. And here is the final and most important point Neville made about time. Desire itself is what creates the sense of delay. Desire requires future. Fulfillment exists only now. The moment you return to wanting, you recreate a future in which fulfillment must arrive. And as long as fulfillment is future, it cannot be present. The law is exact. Time does not test you. Time reflects you. And when you stop testing reality, when you stop asking when, you step out of the psychological structure that produces delay. In the final section, we will bring everything together and confront the quiet turning point Neville pointed to again and again, the moment wanting dissolves on its own and life begins to move, not because you demanded it, but because there is nothing left obstructing the law's natural operation. Chapter 8. The moment wanting ends. When reality begins to move. Neville Goddard taught that manifestation does not begin with effort, desire, or intention. It begins with cessation. Not the cessation of action, but the cessation of wanting. This is the turning point that few people recognize because it does not feel dramatic. It does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, almost unnoticed, yet everything changes from that moment on. Wanting ends naturally when a state is fully occupied, not suppressed, not resisted, not argued with. It ends because it has no function left. Neville explained that desire is like a question consciousness asks itself. Once the answer is accepted inwardly, the question dissolves, and when the question dissolves, the law moves unobstructed. This is why he warned that letting go is not an action, it is a consequence. People try to let go as if it was something to do, but letting go happens automatically when acceptance is complete. You do not let go of hunger, you eat. You do not let go of thirst, you drink. And you do not let go of desire, you assume fulfillment. When this assumption stabilizes, something subtle but unmistakable occurs. You stop monitoring your inner world. You stop rehearsing the outcome. You stop imagining how others will react. Not because you disciplined yourself to stop, but because the mind has moved on. This is the sign Neville said to look for, not excitement, not certain spoken loudly, but a disinterest in the mechanics of fulfillment. The one who has accepted something no longer watches it arrive. This is where the law activates fully. When wanting ends, the inner resistance that blocked expression disappears. The law no longer receives mixed instructions. There is no longer a contradiction between what is desired and what is assumed. Consciousness becomes singular. And when consciousness is singular, reality reorganizes with astonishing efficiency. Neville was careful here. He did not say that things will always happen in the way you expect. In fact, he emphasized the opposite. The law often chooses paths that the rational mind would never select. Events unfold naturally, sometimes indirectly, sometimes through apparent detours, but always with precision. This is why Neville said that the bridge of incidents is built without your consent or understanding. Your only responsibility is to occupy the end. Once occupied, the bridge assembles itself. People often miss this because they expect movement to feel like effort. They expect signs to look like confirmation. But Neville taught that movement often feels like life simply continuing, until suddenly it is not the same life anymore. A conversation shifts, an opportunity appears, a decision feels obvious, and only in hindsight do you recognize that something has been rearranging all along. This is the moment when people say, "It happened when I stopped caring." Neville would correct that language gently. You did not stop caring, you stopped wanting. And wanting was the only obstruction. Caring belongs to identity. Wanting belongs to separation. When you assume the state, you still care, but you care from fulfillment, not toward it. Neville often described this as rest. Not physical rest, but psychological rest. The end of the inner argument, the end of negotiation, the end of self-persuasion. And rest is powerful. Rest is the signal that nothing more needs to be done inwardly. When the inner work is complete, the outer world must respond, not eventually, inevitably. This is why Neville warned against returning to desire after assumption. Even briefly, even subtly, the moment you begin to want again, you reintroduce separation, you split consciousness, and the law, exact as ever, reflects the split. The work then is not to keep wanting to live. The work is to remain where wanting is unnecessary. This remaining is not tense, it is not watchful, it is not vigilant, it is calm, it is unremarkable, it feels almost like forgetting, and in a sense it is. You forget the desire because you no longer need it to point you somewhere. And this is the final irony Neville revealed. The thing you wanted so badly begins to move only when you no longer need it to. Not because you became indifferent, but because you became complete. Neville Goddard's teaching leads to one unavoidable conclusion. The law never failed you. It has been operating with perfect fidelity from the beginning. It has reflected every assumption, every state, every inner posture with exactness. What failed was not manifestation. What failed was understanding. Wanting was never the creative act. Assumption was, effort was never the missing ingredient. Identity was, time was never the obstacle. Inconsistency was, you were never meant to beg reality. You were meant to occupy it. The moment you want, you declare separation. And separation is what manifests, but the moment you stop wanting, truly stop, because the state has been assumed, reality has no choice. It must conform, not because it favors you, not because you earned it, but because consciousness, once settled, always externalizes itself. This is the law Neville Goddard understood. This is the law you have been living under all along. And now that you see it clearly, there is nothing left to chase, only a state to remain in. Epilogue: The silence after understanding. At this point, there is nothing left to add, and that, perhaps, is the clearest sign that the law has been understood. Neville Goddard did not end his lectures with excitement. He did not try to leave people inspired, energized, or emotionally elevated. He left them quiet, because quiet is where assumption lives. Quiet is where wanting dissolves. Quiet is where the law can finally operate without interference. If you are listening to this now and something feels settled, if the mind is no longer racing to apply, fix, or improve, then you are closer to the truth than any technique could ever take you. Neville said that understanding does not announce itself loudly. It arrives as a subtle reorientation, a shift in how you relate to yourself, a change in how urgently you feel the need to become someone else. You may notice that the desire you once carried feels different, less sharp, less demanding, less central. That is not a loss. That is the completion beginning. The law does not ask you to give up your desires. It asks you to stop outsourcing fulfillment to the future. It asks you to stop treating reality as something that must be convinced. It asks you to stand where fulfillment already exists and allow life to reorganize around that position. Neville often said that the greatest act of faith is not belief, it is rest. Rest from effort, rest from negotiation, rest from the inner argument about whether you are allowed to have what you want. When you rest in a state, you are no longer asking life for permission. You are no longer declaring separation. You are no longer rehearsing absence. You are simply being. And being is creative. This is why Neville insisted that imagination is God. Not imagination as fantasy, but imagination as conscious positioning. Where you place yourself inwardly is where you will find yourself outwardly, always, without exception. If this understanding feels unsettling, that is natural. It dismantles the last refuge of the ego, the belief that effort earns reality. But once that belief falls away, something far more stable takes its place. Inevitability. Not hope, not optimism. Inevitability. The inevitability that comes from alignment with law rather than struggle against it. You do not need to remember everything you have heard. You do not need to repeat it. You do not need to work with it. You only need to notice one thing again and again. Are you wanting it or are you occupying? The answer to that question determines everything. And if from this moment forward you find yourself wanting less, not because you suppressed desire, but because it no longer defines you, then the law is already moving, quietly, precisely, unstoppably. This is the law Neville Goddard lived by. This is the law that has been governing you all along, and now there is nothing left to seek, only a state to remain faithful to.